augmenting human intelligence is an amazing weapon, right? And augmenting the human economy. It gives us amazing power to fight off any other risk. But there's that catch 22 where, oh, you like augmenting intelligence? Okay, you just built a super intelligence, it's going to wipe you out. And that's why even Sam Altman himself talks like this, where he's like, look, we need more intelligence, like the problems that are coming in our society or the stalled growth that we're seeing. We need intelligence to push out of this. Okay, yeah, fair enough. Intelligence would be good, but you're just going to make a super intelligence that's just going to game over very soon. Icarus flew too close to the super intelligent sun.
Talking about the dangers of AI still feels pretty weird to me. How does one talk about the literal end of the world in decades or less from a source that sounds like the plot of a science fiction movie? Despite all the arguments, clear warning signs, and statements from tech leaders, it just doesn't feel like the kind of thing one talks about in the same way one discusses, say, a presidential election. But that weirdness makes these conversations all the more important, because they may not stay science fiction for long. My guest today is Liron Shapira, tech entrepreneur and angel investor, who is also a vocal activist for AI safety. He is engaged in several lively debates on the topic, including with George Hotz and also an online group that calls themselves the Effective Accelerationists, both of whom disagree with the idea of AI becoming extremely dangerous in the foreseeable future. Before we get into the interview, I'd like to explain a few names and terms that came up during the conversation to make this video as accessible as possible. Eliezer Yudkowsky is one of the first people to sound the alarm about AI becoming dangerous, writing extensively on the topic on Less Wrong, a popular blog. He has worked as an AI alignment researcher at MIRI, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute. Rob Miles runs a popular YouTube channel on AI safety, echoing many of Eliezer's ideas. FOOM is the idea that AI will eventually reach a threshold of intelligence where it can improve itself, triggering a feedback loop where the more it self-improves, the more capable it becomes of further self-improvement, i.e., booming. Instrumental convergence is the idea that some goals, such as survival, power-seeking, and self-improvement, are instrumentally useful to almost all other, seemingly unrelated goals, and thus will be desirable to intelligent agents, including future AI, by default. Corrigibility is a desirable property of AI, explored by Eliezer at MIRI, where a system allows itself to be shut down, despite being sophisticated enough to recognize incentives to resist. Quick warning, I was horribly sleep deprived when I filmed this interview, so parts of it are rather choppy. With that, here's Liron.
What, in your view, is the scenario where things go well? Not just like technical considerations, but also considering social governance. Look in the future, what are 50 or whatever years from now, we're looking back, it's like, oh yeah, we're really glad we got through that period. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much insight on that. I'm just happy to have any semblance of the goodness I'm familiar with, right? So like I don't even think that much about heaven. I'm just like, we're going toward hell. That's kind of my wheelhouse is don't go to hell. I have a low bar, right? And it's why I'm doing a lot less angel investing. I'm not trying to get that rich because I'm just like, look, if I don't have any money, but the world is decent quality of living, I will take that win.
The reason I'm bringing that up is a general thing that I see both when training ML models and also just like in education and all sorts of other things. Knowing what you're moving towards is often just as, if not more efficient than trying to enumerate a bunch of things that you want to avoid.
Yeah.
So it kind of gets down to like what the important thing is. Is it people coming together and stopping the large training runs until alignment can catch up? Is it some big insight somewhere? Is it some stroke of luck?
How do we possibly not die? What's the most
Yeah.
likely conditioning on not dying? What becomes the most likely prediction? I tend to just go to slow tech progress, another AI winter. Even though it feels like we're on the threshold of just surpassing human intelligence in every way, maybe we get 30 years, right? That's kind of like the ideal. And then we probably squander those 30 years, right? So if you tell me I'm alive in 2040, I'll be like, well, we're probably going to die in 2050, 2060. But if you tell me I'm alive in 2100, I mean, I don't even know. It just seems so implausible that we'll have an AI winter of more than 30 years. So if you say, okay, it's 2100 and we're still alive, I'll be like, oh, there's probably not an AI winter that long. So what could have possibly happened? It would probably just get into unknown territory of, well, it turns out that the pace of everything was just very conveniently smooth or comfortable. Like all these people who are like, oh my God, we're going to need trillions of dollars of GPUs or 100 trillion or whatever, right? Like conveniently hardware scaling or just like some very convenient scaling properties. But that's not what I expect.
I would agree, but another AI winter that's like really long seems implausible just because there's money now. The winters, they weren't producing anything economically valuable, so the funding dries up and people stop working on it. Now there's useful applications. Even if there's no vertical breakthroughs, there's lots of space to expand and make things and keep the money flowing, which keeps researchers working on it, and eventually someone's going to have the insight. My personal side of it is more on the governance and people making the right decisions and get time by choice. There's been a lot of squandered time, but it takes something for the people that need to have a reason to respond.
Yeah, sure. So we just get a convenient amount of time to fix it when people are actually trying.
That would be the hope. I think there's indications for it. Some people in governance starting to take it a little bit seriously, at least a few, more than I would have expected. More than I would have expected amount of top labs like the super alignment team. I have a lot of questions about that approach, but that it's happening at all is kind of miraculous. And just how receptive the public is.
I watched the lectures at the recent AI safety conference that they posted on YouTube. I watched those lectures and it was fucking pathetic.
Oh, really? Well, it was.
I mean, it's just like, I mean, look, the people are trying hard, right? But it's kindergarten, man. I mean, all of that together adds up to less than Eliezer already knew 15 years ago. And there's also people going in the wrong direction. There was one person who was like, is this a joke? Where they're like, I surveyed a bunch of humans. I surveyed them on the correlation between intelligence and agentiness. So I showed them different examples of things that have intelligence. I think it was like, oh, animals, machines, whatever. And I'm like, okay, how intelligent do you think it is? How agenty it is? And he's like, surprisingly, you can be more intelligent and less agenty. So this might bode well for super intelligent AI. It's like, are you kidding me? That's like such a narrow survey. Doesn't tell you shit. I just can't believe that is being presented at a conference that the same year as GPT-4. It's like, oh God.
What's been your experience of being in the public discourse and debating people? Do you feel like that helps?
I actually do. I don't know how much, but the reason I think it helps is because I think that people don't even know what the doomer stance is. And that's why I don't think when I have these debates, to the extent that I get an audience, I don't think I'm just running up against a brick wall. I think people are coming away educated, like, oh, yeah, these are a bunch of issues. Like just understanding what my position is, not even the arguments for it, because I still see a lot of intelligent people writing counter arguments that aren't addressing the strong points of my position.
Do you feel like the education's going to the person you're talking to, or that's kind of a brick
Uh,
wall on the audience is what matters?
my mindset when I'm having one of these debates is I'm just doing it for the audience, right? Like I'm not actually trying to convince the person I'm talking to. I'm just trying to explain to the audience. But I mean, it doesn't really vary. Like if my goal was to convince them, I would just employ more tact where I would try to not frame it as like, you think this, but I think this, right? I wouldn't frame it as directly oppositional. I guess I would try to make it take longer, but maybe try to make them think like it's more their idea or like I'm just probing. But that said, there's not like a massive difference. The way that I argue is I don't use rhetoric. Like I come in there and I'm like, okay, let me present to you my crux. Let me present, here's my belief. Here's what would change my belief. You're welcome to try to change my belief. Like this is the path, right? It's my job to tell you how to change my belief. Hopefully you do the same to me, right? Like what rationalists call double crux. I feel like sometimes I go on a soapbox or whatever, and I'm like, this principle is good. But if I'm saying that stuff, it's because that's my belief, right? I feel like that corresponds to how I think about stuff. I think it's okay for the audience, right? So I'm not really discouraged, like, oh my God, this person that I was trying to convince didn't get convinced. That doesn't really bother me. I'm just thinking about, is the audience getting quality content out of this? If sometimes they see that the other person's going in circles, maybe that'll make them think that the other side doesn't know what they're talking about, right? Or isn't as well studied in this stuff, which is kind of valuable. I mean, it's not the ideal to go in circles, and that's why I said like, hey, I think we're going on circles on this topic. Let's benefit the listeners with a different topic. I don't get that much direct feedback from listeners being like, wow, I was a total dismisser and now I'm very worried. So it's rare for me to hear about like a major mind change. But a lot of people just say, hey, it seemed like you had better arguments, right? So I don't know what that means for their own mind change. My audience wasn't huge, right? Like it was reasonable, and I'm happy to do it again with that size audience, but it wasn't like a notable event. I think that these kind of debates are very important, like arguably more important than the presidential debate. Certainly they're more rare. I mean, presidential debates is once every 4 years, and they're pretty impactful. And this is once in a history of an intelligent species.
What do you think is the baseline that everyone just really needs to know about? Is there just like a small amount of stuff and everything else is just as you're interested, or is it like it's really useful to have a comprehensive view?
I think I've zoomed the argument all the way out pretty far. I say that it's just 2 steps. And step 1 is we're close to having super intelligent AIs. And step 2 is a really smart super intelligence is incredibly dangerous to humanity by default. right? Like those are the two steps. And I think there's a nice separation between the two steps where step two is we're just talking about like the theoretical ideal of a superintelligence. And then step one, we can talk about, are we imminently close to having anything like a superintelligent ideal? Like, so that, but it does factor nicely. But that zooms the argument all the way out. And some people might just look at those two steps and be like, yep, that's scary. I'm convinced. But then some people start zooming into both at the same time. They kind of forget the distinction and they jump around on all their different objections. It's not that complicated, but if you want to push on one of the points, then we have to zoom in and more relevant details come in. And there's a lot of interesting parts, and there's different parts where people get off the doom train. And some of the parts are like interesting and complex. Like I read a guy's post yesterday who gets off the doom train. His area of the doom train is just that he models intelligence as LLMs that need data. So then I would have to bust out some reasoning like, okay, but you know that this is just today's AI. It doesn't represent the entire trajectory of AI, right? Eliezer says you can't even lay out the argument because everybody just wants to wander into like their own personal corner and get stuck there. But I don't know. I haven't had that many debates, so I don't really know personally what the lay of the land of people who don't believe me is.
Have there been any objections or lines of reasoning that gave you pause or required a little bit more of, okay, I haven't seen this before?
So the debates I've had with George Hotz and the Accelerationists, I really don't think tested my model at all. It really just felt like they're really groping in the space of ideas, and I just have to give them like the basic flashlight of, well, do you know about this idea? Do you know that's what I felt there. The times when I'm like, maybe there's something I'm missing. When I most get that sense, which is not to say I get it that strongly, but I get it a little bit, is when I hear a really smart person who is also kind of aware of the problem. So like a good example would be Dario Amodei, right, from Anthropic, obviously extremely smart, capable guy, aware of the problem, making a strategic decision to lead his own AI lab. But the way he talks about it and the way he sees the world is nuanced and admits uncertainty. I think he would admit that, yeah, maybe he is actually helping accelerate doom. I think he would give that a significant probability, like 10%, and maybe I would give it more of like a 40% probability, or maybe I disagree with his decision making. But when he talks about how he sees the future going, he's seeing a more optimistic scenario. He's expecting to muddle through more than I am. And so that's probably the biggest place where I'd be like, okay, maybe I'm wrong because maybe we can just take it one step at a time, which is highly intuitive. Like if I wasn't really reading Eliezer for 15 years, I would totally get the intuition because I have the intuition very deeply from just like using computers, right? Like and watching software come out and like tinkering with APIs and like software is awesome. And like, and then it breaks and then they have to fix it. And like the pace is fine. And sometimes it's fast, like watching web browsers come out. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of innovation, but like it's all chill and it's great and it's positive, right? So like I totally have that intuition that AI can just follow that same software path. But I think it's logically wrong to be like, oh, AI is just like shrink wrap software compared to being like, AI is the next tier of intelligence. I feel like that intuition is going to be much more predictive. It's why the tech Twitter, it's why the tech community tends to be the techno optimists about AI, while normal people, they don't really have the intuitions for like, oh, you just got to roll with the software. You just got to roll with capitalism. Like it all creates value in the end. They don't have those intuitions drilled into them. And so they, in my opinion, are coming in with a more correct mental model, even though it's like, they're not authorities. They don't necessarily know what they're talking about, but their default mental model of like, oh, new thing bad. Well, they happen to be right in this one case.
That reminded me of an article I read at one point. Eliezer complains a lot about being really annoyed that the Terminator is the thing that gets shown
Right.
in media and first people's thought. And this person was making the case that actually that's not such a bad reference point. If you
Right.
ignore
Yeah.
the entire screen time, which is Arnold Schwarzenegger,
By the
having
way, I keep meaning to watch Terminator, right? Because I hear it's quite a good movie. And James Cameron is really a unique individual. I just heard that he was even the one who inspired Elon Musk to want to go to Mars. So James Cameron's amazing. Terminator, I think, is a very important movie because, like you said, I think you could do a lot worse than Terminator, right? And I don't even know the exact plot details, but from what I hear, it's like, yeah, the AI is going to overpower humanity. That basic plot point is pretty important and on point.
if there was a better frame of reference, it's simple enough or visceral enough to have that kind of salience that a movie would. Do you have any intuitions as to what that might look like?
Well, so ideally, I guess you want to herd the public into realizing the need for stopping AI development, which is this like such like a distasteful outcome, right? For me, as much as anybody, but I don't really see an alternative. or having a button that we can push to stop as soon as we all get convinced that like, okay, it's gone too far, like now shut it down now, right? And I think a lot of people would agree that there is a point of no return, right? And the trick is to shut it off before the point of no return, which I would argue we're already dangerously close to the point of no return. So can we just have an off button that if we can't press it today, we can be ready to press it once a few more people get convinced? What I'm getting at is the public has to mobilize toward a policy. There has to always be infrastructure for an off button, like super annoying policy. I think naturally there's already these surveys seem to be coming out with results like 70% of the public's worried, something like that. We can already play on people's intuitive fear of this is really going to overturn the natural order. Those kind of fears are always just not calibrated to modern life. But in this case, they happen to be right. So you might as well take advantage of them. It's kind of easy to make people be scared, right? With like a few data points. You can point to a smoking gun of, oh, this person got killed. A bunch of self-driving cars all crashed at once, even because of a hacker, or like whatever. A hacker that AI assisted, right? So like there's probably going to be some notable incidents where people read a lot into those incidents, kind of like those landmark moments like 9/11, like, oh my God, this is what terrorism is, even if it's not necessarily statistically representative, it's just that's going to be the image burned into people's mind, right? Like the next Terminator, except there's more reality to it. I think there's a need for just like more movies like the Terminator, but a little bit more accurate. The biggest missing intuition that I think almost nobody has that I certainly have a lot is just the idea of the super intelligent chess player, right? Except it's not chess. The game board is the whole physical universe, and we are pawns, right? Our atoms are pawns in this big game of chess. It's just a video game, like it just obeys laws, and AIs are getting better at playing increasingly large video games. Like that intuition, I feel like is very much missing in people. So they see the chatbot and they're like, yeah, it's just chatting. Like they're not connecting the dots. Although the average person kind of is, right? The average person is like, I don't know what AI is up to, but I don't like it, right? That's like the average person. And like, that's not far off.
You mentioned a need for being able to have a stop switch on this and to be able to slow development. Do you have any idea what the back on condition would be in that case?
Yeah, I think it would be a very annoying condition that would take like years or more likely decades to research, which is just understand how to make an AI aligned or at least prove that we can have an architecture that has an off button, right? Like the corrigibility project that Miri tried for a couple of years that they basically gave up on for now, or they just concluded it's going to need a lot more work. It's a good question, right? It's like the way I personally think, I'm just like, look, just don't worry about turning it back on. Right? Just like we'll know when the time is right. Like there will be strong arguments that the time is right. Just err on the side of keeping it off.
Are there any alignment approaches that you've seen? You mentioned OpenAI and Miri already that just intuitively seem like, oh, that seems like a really good approach. I would like
Yeah.
to see that followed further.
So there's no one single approach that's a good approach, but I think Miri is very notable for just having the most depth. I feel like a lot of people like to dunk on Miri or act like they haven't done much, but you can go look at the conference that I pointed, right? The recent AI alignment conference with people from top AI labs. And the stuff that they were talking about was kindergarten stuff, right? Like base level stuff. There wasn't much depth to it. And like you said, okay, it's a new field. All right, but Miri is early to the field and they have laid some foundations, like pointing out that corrigibility is hard. That's the kind of progress that you see when you have a field like complexity theory. Some of the first results are results about how hard the more important results are, right? Like these meta results. And Miri has been delivering that. And unfortunately, it's kind of like saying, what's the path to proving P doesn't equal NP? Like, I think there is a path, like a long path, right? That'll probably take decades. And I can't just tell you one approach that's going to work because part of the approach is you get in the trenches and you keep disproving approaches, and that's productive. You find approaches by the process of elimination. So it's very much a blue sky research problem, the most important one in the world. That's also the most under resourced. So I can't point to an approach. I would just say Miri, but sucking up all the world's string theorists, all the world's best thinkers. And like, you got to do it for as long as it takes, right? And it's just that recommendation is just with the current benefits of acceleration that we've seen in tech, the current benefits of exponential growth. It's like the world isn't ready to hear a recommendation like that.
Background for anyone watching this, a little bit about Miri. It's the Machine Intelligence Research Institute. Eliezer Yudkowsky was very instrumental in forming that. It's been around for a while, long before most other people were hearing about alignment and AI safety. I would say characterize their approach as deconfusing the space around this and just getting a lot of fundamentals. As an example of that, exploring a lot of decision theory, which, as I understand it, the assumed value of that is imagining the way an ideal agent would reason so that we can make inferences about how future AI will reason. It's like, what extent can they cooperate without communication, things like that.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's very significant that Eliezer has his what was it called timeless decision theory. I think that's very significant because I think he himself has referred to it as like a kind of magic that he did, and everybody loves to criticize him for using arrogant terminology like that. But I can tell you personally that if a really high stakes decision was on my shoulders and I hadn't studied this decision theory stuff and somebody busted out a Newcomb problem on me, I would have bet it all on the wrong bet before I read Eliezer's decision theory. So from my perspective, he did correctly find a magic trick that even if I had a lot of power over the AI, they could have instantly flipped the power dynamic on me by pulling out that kind of decision theory that I wasn't aware of, that Eliezer very nicely deconfused. This is really underappreciated stuff, just like the stuff from the conference is overrated, right? Like I'm seeing a big gap between like the tangible accomplishments of Miri and the groping that the current effort is doing, which I think eventually will grope to some nice places, but it hasn't groped very much yet.
A point of contention I'm seeing between Miri's approach and OpenAI, that these assumptions they seem to be making, is valuing conceptual inquiry versus empiricism. In one view, we should think about things in advance as much as we can because there's a limited window that we're even going to be able to test this. And on the other side of it is like, you can reason all you want, but none of it matters until you've actually tested it.
Right. Yeah. And Sam Altman has that quote, right? Like that was his diss for Eliezer when somebody asked him, like, what do you say to all the Miri criticism? And he very clearly said that he thinks Eliezer is, to paraphrase, not in the arena, right? Like, and he or that's not even the best metaphor because it's not, the issue isn't that he's not in the arena. The issue is that he's not at the coal face, right? Is that he doesn't see the detail when you really do it, and he can only theorize at the whiteboard. But the problem is that a lot of times it's a good analogy is like perpetual motion. It's like, okay, I'm not on the ground tweaking the exact overbalanced wheel to try to make it spin forever. I agree. I'm at the whiteboard telling you why you can't do that. Like, okay, but you ultimately have to address the arguments of the person at the whiteboard when they're sufficiently powerful, general principles with some empirical support from what we're seeing with the human brain in our heads trying its hardest to grow because the intelligence explosion that we saw in evolution. You already agree with this stuff, but I was really not happy with Sam's criticism of Eliezer and how it's just okay to discard these extremely powerful arguments and just get your hands dirty and see what happens. I get the mental model that Sam has. People like Sam, a lot of people like Sam has, maybe Dario has it too, of just like, look, I know there's this theory saying super intelligent AI is going to foom and there's going to be, instrumental convergence and it's going to go rogue and it's incorrigible. I know there's all this theory, but what if we just tweak this LLM and we just train a bigger LLM, right? They're like, I'm just walking my path, okay? And it's a separate path. And who knows how long they can stay on this path? Maybe they can stay for 30 years, but there's always the risk. Jan Tallinn was on a podcast saying the people at Anthropic and all these labs, they think that there's a 1% chance that just training GPT-5 is going to end the world because that's already going to be enough to have like a submodule that goes super intelligent. It's very much like fuck around and find out. Like they're very much fucking around from my perspective.
That's my personal biggest criticism towards OpenAI is the risk tolerance that they're accepting with it. Like that Sam Altman will even admit to, maybe 10% that this completely goes wrong.
Right.
We can argue about that number. I think it's higher without some kind of governance and intervention. But even so, if you have a button that if you press this, you will definitely get a massive amount of riches, and there's some percentage chance it completely destroys the world. What's the percentage where it's hard to decide whether to press it or not? Or where's the threshold where you're just like, oh, no, that's too risky? And 10 seems high.
Yeah. Well, it seems high, but also as Eliezer pointed out, I'm actually comfortable gambling at those odds because I'm desperate enough that if there is a button I can push, that's like there's a 90% chance that pushing this button makes the Earth go on a nice trajectory, doubling every 10 years for the next century, or better, right? That's like the minimum guarantee. So the 90% is like quite a nice outcome, but there's a 10% chance that there's no more future, like we just blink out of existence forever, that right? All of our descendants, everything. I would be very tempted to press that button, right? I'm leaning toward pressing it. I would obviously consult with a lot of smart people, but I'm leaning toward pressing it because I'm like, look, I think the current situation looks so desperate, I will accept a 10% risk. But when you look at people like Sam, I don't even think that we have that option because I don't think there's a 10% risk. So the problem isn't that I'm not a gambler. The problem isn't that I want to play it safe. The problem is that I think the risk is more like 50 or 60%, right? I think the odds are like a lot worse than 10%.
Without that possibility of AI destroying everything, And the biggest risks we had were climate change or an asteroid hitting the Earth or
Mhm.
some other catastrophe that the public is more used to. That seems like it would change the risk tolerance, or at
Yeah,
least
definitely, definitely. I mean, the nice thing about all these other risks is that augmenting human intelligence is an amazing weapon, right? And augmenting the human economy, it gives us amazing power to fight off any other risk. But there's that catch 22 where, oh, you like augmenting intelligence? Okay, you just built a super intelligence, it's going to wipe you out, right? Otherwise, augmenting intelligence is the best. And that's why even Sam Altman himself talks like this, where he's like, look, we need more intelligence, like the problems that are coming in our society or the stalled growth that we're seeing. We need intelligence to push out of this. Okay, yeah, fair enough. Intelligence would be good, but you're just going to make a super intelligence that's just going to game over very soon. Icarus flew too close to the super intelligent sun.
one of Sam's points of that it sees AI, at least in the near term or for a while, as being a tool that augments the people who are using it. I would characterize their approach as using AI to augment alignment researchers so that we can work on these things like a lot faster.
Right, and that's OpenAI's explicit plan, right? Is like we're just going to get the AI to the point where, as it approaches superintelligence, it can be a major help to our research, or even be the primary researcher on alignment. Okay, sure, yeah, like that's a good description of the dream, right? Which is the power relationship stays convenient, and there's no point at which it goes rogue, right? That is the dream, but just approaching it with that hope, especially with Jan Leika's video for their alignment research, it was definitely one of the presentations that I thought was very shallow, right? Like the way that he talks about OpenAI's alignment agenda. It just seems like somebody who doesn't know about perpetual motion laws, right? Like isn't really aware. And like, he probably is aware to some degree. I'm pretty sure he is. I'm just not getting the sense that he knows what he's up against when they talk in like, oh, we're gonna make the AI do the alignment for us. Like, I don't think they know how hard that is.
One particular problem I'm worried about is it not necessarily being a clear line when we pass the threshold from where the biggest problem in getting AI help isn't its ability to be helpful, but its trustworthiness. That what it's trying to do is
Right.
like
Yeah, and we haven't really seen serious deception because we're just there's a lot of time. There's still a lot of the sense of like, okay, yes, you're giving like a very smart essay, but I'm still the boss here. I'm still the alpha. Like I could shut you off. Like there's still our intuition hasn't quite been tested or hasn't quite been upended. One avenue where it might, but I was thinking was something like a Boston Dynamics situation, right? Like so if we can get the Tesla Optimus or whatever, if you can get a situation where the Optimus is like actually coming in and beating people at jujitsu, right, or even used by terrorists to really to be like, okay, well, you have a few Optimi, you have a SWAT team, like the Optimi are going to overpower the SWAT team. Like now you've got like a serious force, and so you can intuitively be like, oh shit, like this is already Terminator.
the models right now are not capable enough to be deceptive. If they were, would we know?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we might not, right? But like, I guess it's possible that every time that we're poking fun of like, oh, when you slightly alter the problem like this, they're getting it wrong. Which, by the way, it's kind of rare, right? Like, it's overrated. People always accuse them of getting it wrong, where it's like, I think that they're doing more than people give them credit for. But anyway, there are situations even I found where they legitimately get something wrong. They kind of like fail to debate me well, for example. That's a pretty robust situation in certain cases. So anyway, those situations you might argue what if it's just deceiving you? And like, yeah, it could be the case just because of how inscrutable, right? Like how little mechanistic interpretability we have. Like we have to honor that that's a possible case. We have to give that a 2% chance, that order of magnitude, right? I'd say it's probably less than 10%. And the reason I'm pretty sure it's less than 10% is just that, like, I guess I'm just interpolating, right? They have other signs of deceptiveness. So it would be like they have unexpectedly high deception powers, how good they're deceiving us compared to how inconsistent their other powers are. Because look, at the end of the day, what if their deception powers are really good and all the other powers are fake, right? Like that is a possibility. So I mean, it's solid 2% or 5% or whatever you want to say. So like, look, any question is valid about these AIs. They're huge, inscrutable systems. We definitely should be more afraid than people are. It's the opposite of my perspective is that people are like, are you afraid of linear algebra? It's like, yeah. Yeah, like yes, we should be afraid of what's in the matrices.
Yeah, no, think that would be a false analogy there because the analog to linear algebra in our case, I would see as being like the evolutionary process. And
Right, exactly. Yeah. Are you
are
afraid
you
of atoms? Are you afraid of, a field that you can signal through? It's like, yes, it's like, do you know what reductionism is, right? It's like when you talk about something that something's made of, like, yeah, the properties of the lower levels in a system are not always isomorphic to those of the other levels, right? So you can't just reduce something down to an atom and be like, oh, I'm not afraid of one atom. There's no atomic property that I'm afraid of. It's like, okay, well, emergence.
coming back to that question of the empirical divide that OpenAI has taken, I think I would describe their overall assumption there and a lot of other places is that, like, okay, even if we assume alignment's a problem, we need AI for that problem.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so, yeah, what's your like Sam Altman's here. What do you say to him to try to get him out of that mind? Like at this point, the race has already started, so one person is less important. But what do you say
Yeah.
to that mindset?
I mean, my alternative would just be to keep doing human-based alignment research. And then when you prove, okay, here is a class of AIs that we can make that's going to be corrigible, then go ahead and make that class of AIs. But also you don't want to be distributing it to the public because you don't want somebody to take it and run the next version on their laptop. So I would basically recommend a Manhattan Project situation where it's like, okay, here are the trusted scientists, right? A group similar to the Manhattan Project that we have, with some international oversight, but like some very respected professors or like an Oppenheimer type, right? At the end of the day, you'd have to give some authority to something like an Oppenheimer if you want this to be run properly. And then, yeah, and they go off and research and they get to play with more capable models, but they also have more judgment and the ability to turn it off before they trickle out previous versions of the world, which is kind of like what OpenAI did with GPT-2. That process was pretty good. If they wanted to keep doing that and keep being a closed organization like a Manhattan Project, and they were run that way and not open, then that's pretty much what I recommend, as long as they're treading carefully and their MO isn't always, let's build the next one and see. Because that's also another beef is I don't support being like, let us now train GPT-5 and then we'll decide if the public can handle it. Because the biggest risk I'm worried about is that the GPT-5 itself will explode in the data center, right? And take them down before they can warn the public. So I disagree with some details of their approach, but the idea of let's be closed AI instead of open AI and we're the Manhattan Project, that I support.
That point of what the biggest risk is, I think, it also seems to be a big crux in a lot of these debates. If I were to characterize the EAC's position, it's that the biggest risk is centralization of power.
Yeah, and it's like, look, they have all these values that I also share, right? It's like Harry Potter and Voldemort. Yes, I don't care for centralization of power. I've been an internet junkie my whole life. I subscribe to all these ideals. I'm transhumanist. That's all true. But I also think that the chance of literally having us all die in the next decade or two is just a bigger consideration. And it's funny that people even try to bust out the expected utility argument on me. They're like, you call yourself a utilitarian? Can't you do this math? AI can be positive, AI can be negative. And I'm like, okay, but it can be very negative very soon. Like I am doing the math, right? It's like very obvious math.
Also, it comes down to what you ultimately like see the probabilities are. If you see this AI going rogue as being this really small, vanishingly small probability, I think timelines matter for that also. If you put things more than 40, 100 years out, but agree that we're on that trajectory, then that just introduces a lot of unknown unknowns, time to respond, other stuff going on. That's one category of thing. Another is just people using it in bad ways, which would go against the open source model also. And then centralized, some single organization just uses it to control everything. One sort of objection I have on some of that is even if you see the AI going rogue as being the issue, all of those are valid and there's an order in which they become available. And I think like the question is how far apart they are. People use it, regular people using AI in bad ways or governments using AI in bad ways. Seems like it would happen before AI itself becomes dangerous as its own entity.
Yeah, I mean, and I agree. And maybe that could be the warning shot that we need.
That's also one of my more semi-pessimistic ways that things could work out is there's a mid-level crisis like a pandemic or something, and that creates the governance, but I would prefer not to have to rely on something like that.
Right. I mean, and it's going to be very interesting. Like, what kind of states do we get into of these like intermediate? And I even thought when GPT-4 came out, I'm like, there's a pretty decent chance, 15%, something like that, where somebody might just use GPT-4 to build the ultimate virus. And a single viruses that aren't that smart have caused $50 billion of damage in the past. So I would be like, it seems pretty likely to me that 50 billion could be a trillion, right? With a few tweaks to hide better. I don't even think that we've seen necessarily all the effects play out. Like obviously my probability is lower now. I don't want to lower it too much, but I'll lower it to 10%, let's say that like 10%, but also the GPT keeps improving, right? So
Right.
10% that to put down a prediction that in the next 2 years, we realize that there is a possible GPT-4 powered virus that somebody could have made. Maybe the GPT-5 version educates us of what was possible. In 2 years, somebody could have made a GPT-4 virus that was really, really hard to stop, like an order of magnitude harder to stop than a previous virus. So I think there's still a 10% chance of that because of how adaptable the GPT-4 outputs can be. So anyway, I'm expecting to see terrorism, and I'm expecting my own computer to get recruited to a botnet somehow pretty soon. It's really hard to quantify, and like I'm glad it hasn't happened yet. But like I worry that GPT-5, if it doesn't explode in OpenAI's data center, it's going to empower stuff like that. But I mean, look, GPT-5, the mainline outcome of GPT-5, it's probably something we can tackle. It's probably corrigible, right? Like more likely than not, right? The doom isn't the mainline outcome yet, but when I imagine doom, I imagine like, okay, so GPT-5 gets trained, GPT-6 gets trained. Suddenly the open source community is now off to the races, where it's like they've made it so efficient that now it's like, okay, any laptop is running something with the equivalent power of GPT-5, and they're just a few tweaks away from doom.
You brought up the FOOM argument before, and it was also in the George Hotz debate. How do you feel like that discussion is important? And if so, what's its relevance?
I think the relevance of FOOM is just to point out that superintelligent systems self-improve. And I think I pointed out the other day that even if they don't self-improve, if they're just really, really smart, we're already screwed. Like if you just take the smartest human who ever lived and clone them 1,000 times or 100,000 times or a million times, and you build this army of the smartest human who ever lived or the most capable, right? Like a million Elon Musk brains, right? Network together because they're highly capable in addition to being, not the smartest on some dimensions, but very smart. So like a team of a million Elon Musks, right, uploaded to the cloud, I think that's going to be more formidable than any particular nation state, like even today, right? Like, because I think that for every couple Elon Musk brains, I think you can already recruit a couple humans, right? You can pay them, or you can convince them to your ideology. So I think you're going to have actors, they can already puppeteer, right? Humans in the US or whatever. Like if I had to say the United States versus a million Elon Musk brains in the cloud that run at human speed, I think I'm already leaning toward the Elon Musks, right? Or even just a nation of physical Elon Musks. So just the fact that that's already possible. And then with FOOM, it's like, yeah, if those Elon Musk got to make a next generation Elon Musk that was smarter than human, well, yeah. So look, so you don't have to FOOM, but I just think that it's important to point out that there are FOOM dynamics. So for example, GPT-5, it could be this huge system in the data center, but it could come up with a script that could bootstrap a superintelligence, and the script could only be 10 megabytes or 1 gigabyte. Like it could be very compact, and it could just quickly zoom over the web and infect another computer. And it doesn't have the whole GPT-5 baggage with it because it's a bootstrapping script. Like you should see these like 128 kilobyte or 64 kilobyte demos of these incredible graphics that people make just to show what's possible with very, very compact pieces of code. So FOOM is just a kind of an intuition pump of just, and the other thing it pumps your intuition is the same thing as a nuke, which is like, once it's gone critical, once it's exploding, there's no actions you can take. It is just going to keep exploding until it runs out of fuel. And there kind of is no running out of fuel until like this galaxy is long gone. So FOOM is like a good intuition for that kind of physical dynamic.
One thing that I've heard Rob Miles complain about, and I can see this comes up in our arguments regularly in some forms, that whole tension between the thing you're talking about is too abstract, give me a scenario. That scenario has flaws in it. That's not going to happen. Is that something you run into personally and when you're talking about this, or
Yeah. That's a very popular objection. Yeah. And I don't know if I have a great answer, right? It's just like people bust out, there's the chess metaphor of like, I can't tell you how Gary Kasparov's going to beat you, right? I can't tell you which piece he's going to move, but you should know that he's going to beat you because that's kind of how intelligence works within a domain. And then when people are like, okay, specifically, physically, how will I die? And then there's the sci-fi answer of like, well, look what's causally possible in this universe, right? You can make nanotech. And they're like, oh, okay, so you're resorting to science fiction. Right. So the people have like an objection to a science fiction type answer. So it's kind of tough to explain in a way that's palatable, I guess. Yeah. So I don't know. I think it's an open problem exactly what to say in response to that question.
Is there anything that you want to bring up that you don't really get a chance to very often in public discourse, or just things that should come up more?
The level of the discourse, if you just go read Less Wrong, the thousands and thousands of pages of Less Wrong, there is just deeper, farther along thinking than you're seeing in the discussions today, even from people at AI Labs, right? Like Eliezer did just serially chain together a bunch of inferences that people are still getting dragged along today, even at the highest levels of discourse. We rarely have to be like, okay, well, so how does fun theory work, right? So if you have a utility function for the whole universe, what are the nuances of it? How do non-person predicates work? So how do you know that something isn't sentient? What predicate do you use for that? So you make sure not to have S risks, right? Or you create a bunch of suffering beings as you're doing your AI. I mean, these issues have now just been brushed aside as like they don't even come up because people are struggling with the basics. And so it is kind of funny to look at Eliezer like this one pioneering figure who like thought so far into the field and now it's crunch time. So I guess my answer is just that, or like the level at the OpenAI or at the alignment conference. I guess I just wish people would come prepared with actually understanding the stuff that's already been done. I guess that's just my only answer is try to put together these pieces that are available right on the internet, but it does take some study.
I was thinking also with the empiricism versus conceptual divide is that it would be nice if someone wants to test things, fine, but at least respect the conceptual work that's been there and say, someone has thought about this. They have predicted this would happen. This test is going to give me a lot of evidence about whether I should trust that more, rather than just saying, I'm going to pretend that doesn't exist and now I'm discovering something new entirely. And I also think that all this skepticism on all these fronts could have the potential to be really useful rather than just a thing to be overcome. Like if it was directing towards what are the things that we really need to learn? What are the sticking points? What are the areas of uncertainty? Where should we focus our attention? Because just having one perspective of it's going to be like this, we would miss a lot. Any closing thoughts on what might be able to bring people together so that the people who have a very low probability for all this stuff being an issue could be productive in the debate and actually making the world safer?
I think more debates are good. I'm really happy with the debates I've been having, and I was really happy when there was that forum with Jan LeCun and Max Tegmark, Yoshua Bengio, and Melanie Mitchell. I was really happy to see that forum, and it was interesting because I don't feel like we're getting enough. I think there's an appetite for more, and there should be an appetite for more.
Thank you for feeding that appetite for getting people to think more about this and be more aware of the things. Thanks again for your time.
Hey, thanks. Well, yeah, I enjoyed it a lot.